Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 12 p.m. and we are live. Thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Jaleesa with Legal Aid of North Carolina's Helpline. Today we have Amy Heimel presenting for us. If you are unfamiliar with the format of this event, Amy is going to review a PowerPoint presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. If at any point during the presentation you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box on Zoom or the comments section on Facebook. We'll review all questions put in the chat boxes during that Q&A session at the end. Please remember that this is a public forum and legal aid is not representing you at this time. Amy will go over this in more detail, but please remember to keep your questions as general as possible, as we cannot provide any legal advice specific to your individual situation. The session will end when there are no more questions, and regardless of where we are, we will have a hard stop at 2 p.m. With all that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Amy to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jalissa. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Amy Heimel. I'm a staff attorney on the Medicaid appeals team at Legal Aid of North Carolina. Today, we're going to talk about Medicaid billing in North Carolina, specifically what providers can bill for and what they cannot bill for when you are a Medicaid beneficiary. We have had a lot of cases recently for Medicaid billing, so we thought it would be a great idea to give you this presentation just in case you either don't qualify for our services or you are still waiting to be accepted as a case. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about what it means to be a Medicaid patient versus a private patient. A Medicaid patient is a Medicaid beneficiary for whom the provider has generally agreed to go ahead and bill Medicaid for any services or supplies that have been provided. A private patient, however, is a patient for whom the provider is holding responsible for that payment. So in order to be treated as a Medicaid patient and not a private patient, the Medicaid beneficiary must first request acceptance by the provider as a Medicaid patient. So you have to ask them, you have to let them know that you have Medicaid and ask them if they are accepting Medicaid patients. Not all providers accept Medicaid patients. And in fact, some providers that do accept Medicaid patients only accept so many Medicaid patients within their practice. Secondly, you have to be accepted by that provider as a Medicaid patient. So you have to ask, and then you have to be accepted. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So acceptance as a Medicaid patient. A Medicaid patient must request acceptance by doing these actions. You need to provide your Medicaid card or the Medicaid number. You need to tell the provider that you have Medicaid coverage. And if you are in managed care with Medicaid, you need to tell them which plan. Not all Medicaid providers accept all Medicaid plans. So you need to make sure that you're in network, that your particular provider accepts your particular plan. Now, the provider has accepted you as a Medicaid patient when they either put your Medicaid information or your card into their record system, or they're able to obtain other proof of Medicaid coverage. Sometimes providers will look up your coverage on NC Tracks to verify your eligibility. Or if the provider submits a Medicaid claim by billing Medicaid, then they have accepted you as a Medicaid patient. So let's talk first about when providers cannot bill you. Providers cannot bill a patient if a patient's been accepted. I'm actually in the way on my screen, so I'm going to move myself away. Sorry about that. Okay, let's start again. So providers cannot bill if the patient has been accepted. So provider cannot bill you, the Medicaid beneficiary, for services except if there's a copay due and that provider has accepted you as a Medicaid patient. As I mentioned, they don't have to accept you as a Medicaid patient. And if you're not accepted, then the providers can go ahead and bill you as a private patient. But here's the catch. Providers must inform you if you're not being accepted as a Medicaid patient and that instead they are billing you as a private patient before you have any services or receive any supplies. And the reason for this is that gives you, the patient, the opportunity to decline those services and say, no, I've changed my mind. I'm going to go find somebody in network, or I'm going to go see if I can find a provider who accepts Medicaid patients. So again, they cannot bill you for services if they've accepted you as a patient, but if they're going to treat you as not a Medicaid patient, but as a private patient, they have to tell you that before you even see the doctor. They cannot wait until you come out after the service and say, well, we don't accept Medicaid after all, and you're going to owe us this money. That's not allowed. Okay, let's see. There we go. Okay. Also, providers cannot bill fees. So providers cannot bill you, the Medicaid patient, for a fee, for example, a missed appointment fee. So if for some reason you have missed your appointment, maybe you got confused and wrote down the wrong date, something happened with your transportation, you weren't able to get to the appointment on time, the provider who has accepted you as a Medicaid patient cannot turn around and charge you for a missed appointment fee. They also cannot charge you any deposits. We've seen cases like this in the past where the provider has accepted the person as a Medicaid patient, but they're not sure if Medicaid is going to pay for the service. And they're not sure how much Medicaid is going to pay for the service. So what they say is, well, we're going to go ahead and bill Medicaid, but we just don't know if they're going to pay for it. So we want you to put down a deposit. And then if Medicaid pays us, we'll pay you back. They cannot do that. They cannot require you to put down a deposit when you are a Medicaid patient. They either need to do their research and find out whether or not Medicaid is going to pay for the service, or they need to find out if there's a prior authorization required, but they do not come back to you and ask you to put any money down. Now, again, they can bill you or collect at the time of the service for any allowable copays and deductibles when you're in a Medicaid deductible program, but deposits, no. Fees, such as missed appointment fees, no. Also, providers cannot bill you when claims are denied by Medicaid. So if a claim is denied because the provider failed to follow Medicaid regulations, or the claim is denied because Medicaid is saying that the service was not medically necessary, the provider can then not turn around and bill the Medicaid patient for that service. This happens sometimes, we see this as well. This happens sometimes when the provider has submitted a claim that has errors on it. Perhaps they've not used the right coding for the service that was provided, or there's something else that's missing. Maybe they didn't get a prior authorization before performing the service. But if that's the case, they cannot then turn around because of their error, turn around and then ask the Medicaid patient to pay for the service. So let's talk about when providers can bill Medicaid patients. As I mentioned earlier, providers can bill for copays. They can either collect them at the time of the service, or they can bill you for it. So there's a $4 copay per visit for chiropractor visits, doctor visits, non-emergency visits, emergency department visits, optometrist visits, outpatient visits, and that are less than 24 hours, and podiatrist visits. And there's also a $4 copay per prescription. It doesn't matter if it's a generic or a brand prescription. However, there are no copays for these particular beneficiaries. So if a beneficiary is under 21 years old, no copay. If you're pregnant, if the beneficiary is receiving hospice, if you are a federally recognized tribal member, if you're enrolled in the North Carolina Breast and Cervical Cancer Program, children who are in foster care are not subject to copays, nor are beneficiaries living in an institution such as long-term care. Now, this is very important to note. Providers cannot deny you a service because you cannot pay your copay. So if you get to the doctor and they ask you for your $4 copay and you don't have the money, or you only have some of the money, $3, for example, or $1, they cannot refuse to see you because you cannot pay your copay at the time of service. They can bill you for it, and you are responsible for it. It doesn't go away. It's just that when you go to the office, if you don't have your copay, they still have to see you. There are no copays for these particular services for any type of behavioral health, behavioral health services, traumatic brain injury services, or services for intellectual or developmental disability services. Now, providers can bill deductibles. Some Medicaid beneficiaries have a deductible. They have Medicaid based on a deductible because they didn't qualify for another type of Medicaid. So here's an example, a deductible to qualify for Medicaid, as I mentioned, and also for CAP DA services and CAP C services. Now, a deductible is the amount of the medical expense that a beneficiary must have before the Medicaid coverage begins. So this is an amount of money that the beneficiary is responsible for medical expenses before full Medicaid or CAP services begin. Beneficiaries are responsible for medical expenses up to the amount of their deductible, which is usually a rather high amount. So this deductible program is really for people that have a lot of medical bills or very high medical bills. And then after they meet their deductible, Medicaid covers any expenses beyond that deductible amount within their certification period. Providers can bill a beneficiary until they reach their Medicaid deductible. Once they reach that deductible, of course, Medicaid will start picking up the costs, and the provider will be billing Medicaid instead of billing the beneficiary. Whoops, I think I went backwards. I apologize. And here is a deductible billing example. So you have a Medicaid deductible of $1,000. Providers can bill you for services until you meet that deductible. So you're responsible for the $1,000. Medicaid will pay for expenses you have beyond that $1,000. And as I mentioned, you're responsible for that first $1,000. Now, here's where it becomes important. It's important because your medical bills are counted towards meeting the deductible, even if they're not paid. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. And we've seen cases like this. We've had DSS come back and tell the beneficiary, well, you have to pay those bills before they count towards your deductible. That is not what the rule says. The rule says that you have to have incurred those medical expenses. You have to have those medical expenses and be responsible for them, but you do not have to pay them. I mean, eventually you have to pay them, but you don't have to pay them in order for Medicaid, to meet your deductible and for Medicaid to begin. So you may have, maybe you were in the hospital and you have $1,000 worth of bills from being an inpatient. And I know that that's a ridiculous example because it's probably 11,000, but so UNC Health is billing you $1,000. Your Medicaid should still begin even if you have not paid UNC Health any money yet. So I want you to make sure that you remember that because DSS sometimes gets confused on that rule. Okay, a Medicaid patient cannot be denied services or supplies based on their inability to pay for their copay, which I talked to you about, the deductible, which we talked about, as well as coinsurances. However, you're still responsible. As I mentioned, they can bill you for that copay even if you don't have the money. You're still responsible for the deductible even if you haven't paid it yet, as well as any kind of coinsurance. And then the provider can bill you for those particular expenses, as I mentioned. Now, here's something different. A person with a pending Medicaid application can request to be accepted as a Medicaid patient with the provider even before your application is approved. However, I want to caution you because if your pending Medicaid application is denied, then you could be billed for any services or supplies already provided. So be very careful about that. And also remember, it's really up to the provider whether or not they're going to accept you as a Medicaid patient. Providers can bill you for exceeding visit limits. So Medicaid has annual visit limits for a lot of services. Providers will not get paid by Medicaid for visits that are over the annual limit without first receiving a prior approval from Medicaid. Providers can bill Medicaid patients for visits that exceed the annual visit limit. However, just like the other rule, only if the provider tells the patient before the visit Again, that's to give you the opportunity to decide, do you want to pay for this out of pocket, this service, or would you rather wait and not take the service until your visit limit starts over again? Providers can bill patients for non-covered services or supplies. Non-covered services or supplies, that's a really important phrase I want to talk about. After accepting a Medicaid patient, providers can bill a patient as a private patient for services or supplies that are not covered at all by Medicaid. And what I mean by that is that Medicaid never covers them. They're not on the list of things that Medicaid covers. That's what non-covered services or supplies means. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because we have seen cases in the past where beneficiaries are being billed for services that are normally covered by Medicaid, but that the claim was denied for some reason. And the provider came back and said, oh, this is a non-covered service. In other words, Medicaid didn't cover it. That's not what that means. Non-covered services or supplies means services or supplies that Medicaid does not cover, or services or supplies that require a prior authorization before they're being approved, okay? But it does not mean that when a claim's denied, those services and supplies are non-covered. So just be aware of that, because that's something we've seen. The provider must inform, again, this is a rule that happens over and over again, the provider must inform the Medicaid patient before the treatment that they may be billed for those services and supplies. And then again, that gives you an option to decline the service or supply or to agree to pay for it. So what would an example be? I was trying to think of an example when I was putting this PowerPoint together, and I think a good example would be, there are certain medications that have to be given intravenously, like in the office. I believe ketamine is one of them. And Medicaid will not cover that service unless it is being given by a physician in a medical environment. So that would be an example of a service that would be, if it was not being given by a doctor, it would be a non-covered service because they're not following the clinical policy. So in that case, the beneficiary would be responsible for it. Providers can bill third-party insurance. So if you have Medicare or private insurance in addition to your Medicaid, you should definitely tell your provider. If there is a third party that's liable for your medical expenses, such as workers' comp, or I'm trying to think what else, veterans benefits, you should tell your provider. What you need to remember is, regardless of who your insurance is, Medicaid is always the payer of last resort. What that means is it's the final insurance to pay on any claim. Medicaid will not pay any money for any claims until your other insurance first pays their part of the claim. So, for example, if you have Medicare, you need to make sure that you tell your provider that you have Medicare and Medicaid, because Medicare will have to pay first before your claim with Medicaid will be processed and they pay the remainder. If you have Blue Cross Blue Shield or some other private insurance, again, they will have to pay first before Medicaid will look at the claim and determine what their portion is. Providers can bill dual enrollees. A dual enrollee is a Medicaid beneficiary who is also enrolled in Medicare. Not private insurance. Forget about private insurance right now. It's just Medicare and Medicaid together. A provider can bill a Medicaid patient when the patient is enrolled in Medicare, when services or supplies are received, but that patient does not provide the Medicare number or the proof of Medicare coverage. So in those situations, the provider can go ahead and bill the Medicaid patient even though you're a Medicaid patient. Make sure you provide your Medicare information whenever you provide your Medicaid information to providers. Remember, because Medicaid is the payer of last resort, they're the final payer, Medicare must pay first. And so we have also had situations where people have had Medicaid for a long period of time. They become eligible for Medicare. They do not update their provider with their Medicare information. And so the provider only thinks that they have Medicaid. Provider bills Medicaid, and then Medicaid pays nothing. The provider turns around and bills the beneficiary, and then the beneficiary is responsible. So make sure that what you could do if that's a situation is obviously you can call the provider, give them the Medicare information, have them rebill Medicare, have them rebill Medicaid, and then hopefully everything works out depending on the timing. But it's really important that you keep your insurance updated with your providers, especially when something changes, such as receiving Medicare or if your Medicaid changes in some way. Providers can bill when you're not eligible for Medicaid. A provider can bill a patient accepted as a Medicaid patient for services and supplies when the patient is not actually eligible for Medicaid and the services were provided. Now, this is a situation where perhaps you were accepted as a Medicaid patient, but your Medicaid has ended. And so you've been seen by the doctor, and they can now turn around and they can bill you because you no longer are covered by Medicaid. However, a provider who is billing a private patient who is then later found to be retroactively eligible for Medicaid, then the patient is entitled to reimbursement or refund by the provider if Medicaid pays the provider. So that's a lot. So let's talk about that. So in the first instance, you are a Medicaid patient, but your Medicaid has ended for some reason. And even though you were accepted as a Medicaid patient, and usually the rule is they cannot bill a Medicaid patient, in this instance, you no longer have Medicaid coverage. Therefore, they can bill you. In the second instance, you are not a Medicaid patient, you're a private patient. But then you applied for Medicaid and you're awarded Medicaid, and you're awarded retroactive coverage going back in time. So, for example, it's April right now. Perhaps you were awarded back to February and you had Medicaid coverage going backward. In that case, the provider can go ahead and bill Medicaid and be paid for the claim if you, being a private patient originally, had paid out of pocket to the provider for those services because you had no insurance. Then when the provider bills Medicaid and is paid by Medicaid, the provider could then turn around and reimburse you or refund what they were paid by Medicaid to you. So that's how that works. Actually, I believe it would be the entire amount that you gave them, they would give you back. Now, please note that if that is a situation that you run into, and it is up to the provider to decide whether or not they want to go ahead and bill Medicaid, because originally you were not a Medicaid patient, you were a private patient. So it's really up to them. If they decide they're not going to bill Medicaid, then unfortunately you've paid out of pocket, and that's just the way it is. But what doesn't happen here is if you have retroactive Medicaid, you cannot go back to Medicaid and ask Medicaid for your money back. There is no Medicaid to beneficiary reimbursement. It all has to go through the provider. Providers billing for out-of-state services, 40 miles. So there are border providers. Those are providers that are within 40 miles of the North Carolina border. So that would be for Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And these services will be covered by Medicaid as long as they're medically necessary. And they'll be covered just the same as if you were in North Carolina. Now, again, this is just within 40 miles of the border. It is not the entire state of Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The provider must be enrolled with North Carolina Medicaid in order for them to be able to be reimbursed and, for the claims that they're submitting. If they're not enrolled with North Carolina Medicaid, it gets much trickier. And you should call the North Carolina Medicaid Ombudsman and speak with them about that. If you are receiving a bill from a provider within 40 miles of the North Carolina border, sometimes we're able to persuade the provider to enroll with North Carolina Medicaid after the fact, and sometimes it works out, but providers do not have to enroll with North Carolina Medicaid at any time when they're out of state. The other thing I want to note is that you must tell them when you see them that you have North Carolina Medicaid and the managed care Medicaid plan that you have. Now that's within 40 miles of the border. Let's talk about beyond 40 miles. The out-of-state providers are covered only when services are not available in North Carolina, and that requires a prior approval. And prior approval will not be given by Medicaid if Medicaid is not the primary insurance. So if you have Medicare or private insurance, Medicaid is not going to cover services outside of that 40 mile from the border. Also note that referrals are not private prior approval. So if your doctor says to you, I would like you to see a specialist, there's a really great specialist at the University of Tennessee, which is beyond 40 miles from the border. That referral that's not a prior approval. That has nothing to do with Medicaid. Prior approvals are only given by Medicaid, not by providers. So what would need to happen is that the specialist at the University of Tennessee would need to get prior approval, and that service that they would be providing you would need to be a service that's not available within North Carolina. It is most likely that if your provider is referring you to the University of Tennessee, the service is probably not available in North Carolina. Also, these out-of-state providers that are beyond 40 miles, they're also covered when there's an emergency. If it's an emergency medical care, then if the life or the health of the patient would be in danger, if care were postponed or you could not travel, then of course Medicaid is going to pay for that. Now, this also, I want you to note this because this has come up in the past as well. We've had clients that are beneficiaries that have been out of state beyond the 40 miles. They've had an emergency. They were seen somewhere by a provider and they were stabilized and everything is fine. They may have been told, we want to see you back in a month for a follow-up. The follow-up care in beyond 40 miles from the border is not going to be covered by Medicaid in North Carolina. The follow-up care is going to need to be in North Carolina, or the out-of-state provider is going to need to get prior approval from Medicaid for that follow-up care. So just make sure that you're aware of that. If you're out of state and you need to go back, that provider is going to need to get prior approval. And again, the provider must be enrolled with North Carolina Medicaid in order to submit those claims and be paid. So what do you do when you have a bill? The first thing you're going to do is call the provider's billing department as soon as you get the bill. Don't wait. Don't delay. Don't wait for the second bill and the third bill and the collections notice. As soon as you get the first one, go ahead and call them and make sure they have your correct insurance information. Make sure that what they have on file is what you have. Also, for that date of service. Also, ask them, why are you being billed? Excuse me, just 1 second. I'm having an allergy attack. Ask them why you're being billed. If they didn't have your insurance information, then give them your insurance information and ask them to resubmit the claim. This is really important because there are claim time limits that the providers are under with Medicaid. So Medicaid's only going to accept claims within a certain time period. So again, that's why we don't want you to delay. So if they didn't have your insurance information, give them the insurance, ask them to resubmit the claim. Find out if you have a different primary insurance, make sure that they build the primary insurance first and that the primary insurance paid what they were going to pay or denied the claim or whatever they're going to do. And then Medicaid is the second one that they bill. If they have all this information and they say, we have everything that you're talking about, then ask them for a detailed billing statement and check your statement. Is it correct? First of all, look and see, is the date of service right? Is this even your charge, especially with hospital bills? Is the service that you received correct? And if not, then you need to tell them that you're going to dispute the charges. Ask them why, if the claim has been denied, ask them to tell you why the claim has been denied. Is it a billing error? I mean, find out the reason, because sometimes they're saying, "Oh, we'll just bill the patient." They may have errors on their claim, and Medicaid may have told them they have errors on the claim, and they may just bill you anyway. I have a case like that right now where the claim was not a clean claim. It had errors, and instead of correcting the claim and resubmitting it, the provider turned around and billed the beneficiary, which, as you now know, they cannot do. And for some reason, if you did not have active insurance at the time that you received the service, you didn't have any insurance, go ahead and ask for their financial assistance and charity care department, or ask them for a discount. Don't be afraid to ask for help from the provider. Most of them do have some type of either financial assistance, or they can provide a private paid discount. And again, always, you can ask for help. You can get help with billing issues by calling the North Carolina Medicaid Ombudsman. I'm going to read this number. I know you can see it, but I want to make sure anyone that's listening can get the number as well. It's 877-201-3750. And the Medicaid Ombudsman, who are great at solving problems, are open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. If there is a legal issue that they need assistance with, they will refer you to us at Legal Aid of North Carolina. If you have any other issues and you need help from Legal Aid of North Carolina, our number is 866-219-5262. And our intake line is open from 8:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. And it's open in the evenings from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. Monday and Thursday. Also, on the slide is some helpful information from North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services about Medicaid billing. This presentation is on Facebook, so you can always pause and get this information from the slide. And you could share this particular post with your provider to help with any billing issues. And so that's it. That's our presentation for today. This free clinic series about your rights in Medicaid and Medicaid managed care is always on the fourth Friday of every month from 12 until 1. Sometimes it goes a little longer, sometimes it's a little shorter. Our upcoming clinics will be on Friday, May 23rd and Friday, June 28th. We try to do different subjects every month, so we hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm happy to help any way I can. Again, it'll need to be general information. I cannot talk to you about your specific case, but I certainly can answer some questions. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope it was helpful.
Okay, and now we're going to open it up for questions. I just want to remind everyone that you cannot unmute in this forum. So if you do have a question, you would need to type it in the Q&A section on Zoom or the comment section on Facebook. And so it looks like our first question is, can having innovations waiver services or being eligible for pass along override having to have a deductible? Should I reread that again, Amy?
No, not at all. Okay, so the
Okay.
deductible is about how to have eligibility when you don't normally qualify for Medicaid because of being over income. So they've offered this deductible program for people that simply don't qualify for disabled adult Medicaid or children for being over income. So that's the first part. So innovations, for those of you out there, that's a waiver program for services provided to beneficiaries who are intellectually or developmentally disabled. So the question was then talking about, this person didn't say COLA. What did they say? What did they say about?
Oh, they mentioned the pass along
Pass along,
override.
pass along.
Mhm.
Okay. So tell me again what the question was.
It says, can having an innovations waiver services or being eligible for pass along override having to have a deductible?
If you are eligible for pass along, then you should be receiving full Medicaid and then you would not be in a deductible program, if I'm understanding the question correctly. I think that's a situation because you have a couple different pieces involved here. that you should talk to the North Carolina Medicaid Ombudsman and get a referral to us so we can delve into that a little bit more and see if there's an eligibility issue here, that there's been a mistake made, or if there's some other factor involved here that is causing an issue.
Okay, so it looks like our next question is when a beneficiary receives retroactive Medicaid, is the provider obligated to refund any payments beneficiary made prior to getting Medicaid?
Okay, so if it's, as I mentioned in that one slide, when it is retroactive and you've already seen the doctor and you've already made the payment and your retroactivity covers that date of service, the provider may, it's a may, not must. The provider may go ahead and bill Medicaid for those claims, and when they get paid, they can reimburse you. But they don't have to. It's not a must. You've already paid the money. Some providers will go ahead and do that as a courtesy, but there are providers, unfortunately, that will not. And because they didn't accept you as a Medicaid patient at that time because you didn't have Medicaid, they don't have to. But if you can convince them to do it because it's the right thing to do, then they do have to reimburse you the money. They can't double dip. They can't take the money from you and then bill Medicaid and get paid for the same date of service. They have to pay you back. But there's no mechanism to make them bill for services that were provided retroactively that have been paid for. It's bad news. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. We'll just take a few moments just to see if any additional questions come in.
Sure. I'm intrigued by this pass along question. I really hope that I get to speak with that person.
Okay, so not seeing any more questions here. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. So I just would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to Amy for presenting. If you would like to review anything we talked about today, we have posted the recording of today's event to our Facebook. It will be immediately available. You can connect this with or without a Facebook account at www.facebook.com/legalaidnc. If you would like to register for one of our other listen and learn presentations, such as expunction, has a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.